Chicago drowned under a cold spring storm the night everything changed at Cole Meridian Group, and on the 47th floor, only one office still burned with light. Amelia Cole sat alone behind a wall of rain-streaked glass, running her eyes over financial reports her chief operating officer had sent hours earlier, searching for the kind of audit-ready clarity she needed before morning. Buried beneath an old project code her late father had once used, she found a string of transactions that made no sense, numbers moving in directions no legitimate transfer should move. Down the corridor outside her office, a contract maintenance worker named Mason Reed knelt before a malfunctioning electronic lock, untouched by the building's tension, indifferent to the storm beyond the windows. He had passed Amelia earlier that day. She had barely registered him, too consumed by pressure to notice the quiet man in a faded uniform. Mason did not mind. He rarely expected to be noticed, and he preferred it that way. The first sign of danger came as a phone call from a number with no name attached. The voice on the other end was calm, almost gentle, warning Amelia that if she opened that financial folder again, everything her father had built would die along with her. She tried to steady her breathing, but her hand shook as she reached for the security monitor mounted near her desk. Through the grainy feed, she saw 3 men in black step into the lobby using executive-level access cards, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who knew exactly where they were going. She called the front desk. No one answered. She called her chief operating officer, Logan Pierce. His line rang and rang. One by one, the lower floor cameras blinked into static, as though someone were closing a curtain section by section. It was at that exact moment that Mason stepped into her office to check a secondary panel near the wall. Amelia opened her mouth to tell him to leave, then froze as she watched, through the monitor, the 3 men step into a private elevator reserved for senior executives. She understood with sudden and total clarity that they had not come for money. In a whisper barely louder than the storm against the glass, she said the only words that made sense: "They're here for me." Mason did not ask her to repeat herself, and he did not ask why. He simply asked how many other people remained on the floor, and when she said she wasn't certain, he moved. He crossed to the security layout on the wall, studied the door frames, the emergency exits, the curtain track, and the response time of the elevator counter, all within a handful of seconds. Then he acted without hesitation. He threw the mechanical deadbolt, drew the curtains shut, dimmed the lights, pulled the network cable from an auxiliary device, and wedged his maintenance cart into the dead angle beside the main door. Amelia stared at him, stunned that an ordinary repairman could move with such precision under pressure. When she asked what he thought he was doing, Mason answered simply that running into the hallway the moment armed men knew her location would be a death sentence, and that locking the door was never about hiding. It was about choosing the ground on which to stand. The elevator chime sounded seconds later, cutting through the silence like a verdict. 3 men had reached the 47th floor. Ethan Vale stood at the office door first, smiling faintly when he noticed the darkness behind the glass, and knocked 3 times with an unsettling politeness before calling Amelia's name into the quiet. Ethan and his 2 men did not break the door down immediately, because Logan still needed Amelia conscious enough to sign documents and surrender a hard drive he believed she was hiding. Through the door, Ethan explained, almost courteously, that they had only come to clear up a misunderstanding before things went any further than necessary. Amelia recognized his voice instantly. She had seen him once before, sitting quietly in a private meeting with Logan that she had been too distracted to question at the time. Mason motioned for silence, then reached for her phone, disabled the location tracking, removed the back casing, and discovered a thin tracking device hidden beneath it. Amelia went rigid at the sight of it, understanding now that someone close to her had been monitoring her movements for longer than she wanted to imagine. Mason dropped the device into a metal cup and set it across the room to scramble the signal trail. Panic crept back into Amelia's chest. She was not used to depending on anyone, and certainly not on a man she had always treated as invisible furniture in her own building. She demanded to know who he really was. Mason gave her no clean answer, only that he had once worked with locks, with people running from danger, and with men who lied too calmly to be believed. Outside, Ethan ordered one of his men to cut power to the electronic lock, unaware that Mason had already switched the door to a mechanical failsafe. When the man tried a magnetic bypass tool against the frame, nothing happened, and Ethan's confidence cracked just slightly, suspicious now that someone inside understood professional security far better than a janitor should. Mason guided Amelia toward a small wall safe to retrieve the hard drive she had mentioned earlier, the one tied to the strange transactions she had discovered. She hesitated, afraid that he might be one of Logan's men after all, testing her under the guise of protection. Mason looked directly at her and said that if he wanted to hand her over, he would have opened the door the second they arrived. It was a short sentence, but it was enough to make her move. Inside the safe, she found her father's hard drive along with a worn envelope bearing her name in his handwriting, and she had no time to open it before a sound echoed from the side door near the conference room. One of the three men had found a path through the technical corridor behind the office. Mason pulled Amelia into a blind corner using loose cable, a swivel chair, and a fire extinguisher to build an improvised obstacle across the entry point. When the first intruder pushed through and stumbled over the tangled cord, Mason did not lunge forward like a man eager for violence. He waited for the precise instant the intruder lost his balance, then applied a fast, silent wrist lock that dropped the man to the floor before he could even cry out. Amelia watched in disbelief, recognizing in his movements not aggression but exhausted familiarity, the posture of someone who had done this exact thing too many times and resented having to do it again. Mason restrained him with a zip tie from his tool belt, lifted the radio from his hip, and heard Ethan's voice crackle through it, warning his men not to hurt her before she signed. By the end of that exchange, Amelia understood the truth was worse than a robbery or an act of revenge. Logan needed her alive long enough to sign something, and only after that would her usefulness expire. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the wind testing the windows like something patient and unwilling to leave. Amelia pressed her palm flat against the cool surface of the desk, steadying herself the way she had taught herself to do in every difficult board meeting of her career, except this time there was no polished argument that could fix what was happening. Mason watched her gather herself without offering empty comfort, understanding that some fear had to be let through rather than talked away. Mason knew they could not hold the room forever, since Ethan still had two men outside and possibly reinforcements climbing toward them. He told Amelia they needed to understand exactly what Logan wanted, because only by knowing the true target could they hope to survive the night. She connected her father's hard drive to an internal laptop already disconnected from the network, and the files that appeared were a tangle of audio recordings, falsified contracts, duplicated transaction records, and an old video message recorded by her father, Joseph Cole. In the recording, Joseph explained that if Amelia were ever watching this footage, it meant Logan had moved dangerously close to seizing full control of the company. He had long suspected Logan of building a money laundering network through a chain of shell companies, but he died in a car accident ruled accidental before he could expose it. Amelia sat frozen, having spent years believing her father's death was simple misfortune, and now doubting everything she thought she understood about it. The documents revealed that Logan needed her signature to transfer control of a reserve fund worth hundreds of millions of dollars into an offshore entity before the morning audit. If she refused to sign, his exposure would be total. If she signed, she would become the one left holding the blame. Amelia recalled months of conversations in which Logan insisted her father had left behind secret debts that she had to authorize transfer after transfer to keep the company stable. She had trusted him because he was the last person remaining from her father's era, and only now did she see the slow isolation he had engineered around her. Old advisors quietly dismissed, friends gently discouraged from visiting, her schedule controlled down to the hour. Mason watched her not as a target to be protected but as a person watching her entire understanding of her life collapse. He offered no soft reassurance, only practical instruction, telling her to breathe, to keep reading, and to choose the most damaging evidence first. When she asked how he stayed so calm, he told her that panic only saves time for whoever is doing the hunting. Outside, Ethan shifted his approach, broadcasting Logan's voice through the internal speaker system. Logan warned Amelia not to trust the man beside her, claiming that Mason Reed was not even his real name in the personnel file, and that he had once been part of a failed witness protection operation that ended with a woman's death. Amelia turned to look at Mason, the trust she had just begun building suddenly trembling. Mason did not deny it. He admitted that someone had died during an operation he had once been part of, and that he had left that line of work afterward, but he insisted that Logan was offering her half a truth dressed as the whole story. There was no time to explain further, so he gave her a choice instead. Open the door and trust Logan's version, or keep it locked for 10 more minutes while they tried to send the evidence out into the world. Amelia hesitated, torn between her hatred of being deceived and her fear of placing her life once again in the hands of a stranger with an unexplained past. In the end, she chose to keep the door locked, marking the first true turning point of the night, a proud executive learning to trust a man with no title simply because his actions had already proven more honest than any powerful man's words. Mason used the stolen radio to mislead Ethan's position while Amelia tried to encrypt and transmit part of the data to her legal assistant, Madison Grant. But before the transfer completed, the internal network was severed entirely. They were now truly cut off from the outside world. Logan no longer hid behind a phone line. He appeared through the conference screen mounted in the office, proving he had already seized control of the building's internal systems. Dressed in a flawless suit, speaking with the measured calm of a man chairing a routine meeting, he told Amelia that everything she had uncovered was only a fragment of what he called a plan to save the company. He insisted her father had left behind a mess of liabilities and that he alone had kept Cole Meridian from collapsing under the weight of it. Amelia countered with the files from the hard drive, but Logan remained unshaken, reminding her that evidence could be reframed many ways, while her own signature on those transfer orders was undeniably real. If she released the data, he warned, she would be implicated alongside him, and he struck directly at her deepest fear, that she would be remembered as the one who destroyed her father's legacy rather than protected it. Mason listened in silence, piecing together Logan's true intention. The man did not simply want the hard drive back. He wanted Amelia to voluntarily sign a confession admitting that she alone had directed every fraudulent transaction. If she signed, Logan would walk away clean. If she refused, he intended to stage a scene in which a panicked chief executive attacked his security personnel and harmed herself in the chaos of a violent storm. Mason understood there was only one viable strategy left: buy enough time for someone outside the building to receive what they had already begun sending. Amelia asked, almost desperately, whether Mason could get her out of the building entirely. He told her it was possible, though not immediately, since the emergency exits were certainly blocked, the elevators controlled, and the cameras compromised. Their only real option was to make Logan believe they remained in the office while they slipped through a technical passage hidden behind the glass partition wall. While Mason prepared their escape route, Amelia finally opened the envelope her father had left behind. Inside was not another financial document but a private letter. Joseph Cole had written that he once trusted Logan far too completely, and that if a day ever came when Amelia had to choose between her reputation and the truth, she should always choose the truth, because a company could be rebuilt, but a conscience could not. The letter broke something open in her, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to cry without trying to disguise it as composure. Mason noticed but did not intrude. He simply draped his maintenance jacket over her shoulders against the cold room, a small gesture that told her, more clearly than any words could, that he had no interest in controlling her the way Logan had for years. Ethan began forcing the main door open using a small hydraulic device, and Mason knew they had less than 3 minutes left. He built a quick decoy using Amelia's suit jacket draped over a chair near the desk, then played a looped recording of her voice through a small speaker to mislead the low-angle thermal camera in the corner. He pried open a technical panel hidden behind a filing cabinet, and Amelia, astonished such a passage even existed, followed him into the narrow gap as the main door finally gave way behind them. Ethan stormed in, spotted the silhouette near the desk, and ordered his men to seize the target, only to find an empty jacket draped over an empty chair. Realizing Mason had outmaneuvered him completely, Ethan's fury spilled into the radio as Mason and Amelia crawled deeper into the dark technical corridor, his voice trailing behind them. Find that maintenance man, because he is the real problem now. Inside the cramped technical passage, exhaustion finally caught up with Amelia. She was unfamiliar with darkness like this, the dust, the metal groaning under the pressure of the storm outside. Mason moved ahead of her, checking each section with a small flashlight, avoiding maintenance cameras, motion sensors, and fire-rated doors with an ease that confirmed, beyond any doubt, that he was not an ordinary man. When they stopped to rest in a utility closet between the 46th and 47th floors, Amelia finally demanded the truth. If she was going to die that night, she told him she refused to die beside a stranger built entirely of secrets. Mason was quiet for a moment before he spoke. He had once worked within a federal witness protection unit handling cases tied to financial crime, and his role had never been to attack but to walk survivors safely through nights exactly like this one. Years earlier, his team had been betrayed from within, and a woman under his protection had died after their location was leaked by someone she trusted. He was made the convenient scapegoat for failures that had nothing to do with him, and the guilt of it eventually ended his marriage, since he could no longer bear coming home every evening carrying the shadow of that danger with him. From that point forward, he disappeared entirely from security work, taking quiet manual jobs and raising his daughter as privately as he possibly could, never wanting his past to touch her life. His daughter, he mentioned only briefly, was safe that night, staying with family who had no idea what her father was facing. Amelia listened, and for the first time, she stopped seeing Mason as a mysterious rescuer and began seeing him as another person the system had quietly destroyed. She told him she understood what it felt like to be made to carry someone else's failure, and in that shared admission, something between them shifted into real trust. They had little time to dwell on it, because Ethan's men discovered dust disturbed along the panel seams and began tracking them through the corridor. Mason had to choose quickly: continue downward in retreat or push toward the server room on the 46th floor to send out everything they had found. Running alone would only buy them the night, while Logan could simply erase the evidence by morning and finish turning Amelia into the criminal. After reading her father's letter, Amelia chose the server room without hesitation. Mason asked if she was certain, and she told him she had hidden behind her title for too long, and if tonight was the price of correcting that, she was ready to pay it. They broke into the secondary server room, where Mason manually restarted the backup power supply while Amelia connected the hard drive and began transmitting an encrypted package to Madison Grant and to Carter Hayes, her father's former legal advisor. The upload had reached only 42% when Ethan appeared at the glass door, choosing not to charge in immediately, since damaging the servers risked destroying the very data Logan needed intact. He smiled instead, telling Mason he could not save everyone forever, and Mason answered that he did not need to save everyone, only to keep one person alive long enough for the truth to run on its own. The server room became a sealed battlefield, filled with the hum of cooling fans, the pulse of red warning lights, and the relentless drumming of rain against the windows beyond the glass wall. Ethan stood outside with his last remaining man, fully aware that Mason needed time for the upload to finish, and he used that knowledge as psychological leverage. He brought up the failed witness protection case again, claiming Mason had a pattern of standing in front of endangered women only to watch them die in the end. Amelia heard every word, but this time it did not shake her resolve. Her hands trembled slightly as she kept working at the terminal, while Mason refused to answer Ethan's provocation with anger, instead calmly using his utility belt to brace the door handle from within. He converted everything in the room into a weapon if needed: a metal tray, a canister of compressed air, a length of network cable, a server rack rail. Logan's voice broke through the room's speaker system, no longer polite, offering Amelia a way out if she stopped the transfer and signed the papers immediately. He told her Mason could even walk away afterward with enough money to support his daughter for the rest of her life, a deliberate strike aimed at Mason's deepest vulnerability. Amelia glanced at him, terrified for a moment that the offer might actually tempt a man who had already lost so much. Mason only asked Logan one question in return: whether he truly believed a man who had lost his family to a lie would now sell another person's life just to buy himself peace. The answer settled something completely in Amelia, and her trust in him became absolute. Ethan finally broke through the side door. Mason cut a row of server lights, splitting the room into patches of darkness and brightness, and when the first man lunged at him, he did not waste time on a prolonged fight. He sprayed compressed air into the man's eyes, pulled him off balance into a server rack, and bound his leg with network cable before he could recover. Ethan entered more carefully, stronger, more ruthless, and armed with a blade, while Mason remained patient and exact, using the tight space itself to neutralize whatever advantage Ethan thought he had. Amelia watched the upload climb as Mason took a hard blow to the ribs, and every instinct told her to run to him, but he ordered her, sharply, to stay at the terminal no matter what. She stayed, tears falling freely as her fingers kept moving across the keys. The progress bar reached 89% when Logan remotely cut power to the server from outside. The screen went black instantly, and Amelia felt the floor drop beneath her, certain everything had failed. But Mason had anticipated exactly this possibility, having already connected the laptop to a small backup battery hidden inside an equipment cabinet earlier. Amelia restarted the secondary connection, only to be met with a prompt demanding the chief executive's authentication code and a security question her father had personally set years before. The question appeared on the screen: what matters more than keeping the company? Her throat tightened as she remembered the letter, and she typed the only answer that made sense to her now: keep the truth. The system reopened, and the upload resumed climbing past 89%. Ethan, realizing time was nearly gone, drew a short blade and lunged toward Amelia. Mason, injured as he was, threw his entire body between them, absorbing the impact meant for her. The struggle ended when Mason forced Ethan's wrist against a server rail and locked it there, dropping him to the floor as the knife skidded away. The progress bar finally reached 100%, though the screen showed only a brief confirmation that the file had reached recipients outside the internal system with no certainty yet that Madison or Carter had actually received it. Logan's voice returned through the speaker, cold and final, declaring that neither of them would be leaving the building that night. Amelia knelt briefly beside Mason, pressing her own scarf against the wound at his side to slow the bleeding, her hands no longer trembling from fear but moving with sudden, practical resolve. It struck her, even in the middle of danger, that she had spent the entire night being protected by a man whose name she had never bothered to learn before, and that the realization shamed her more than any board meeting ever had. Once the data had been sent, Mason and Amelia believed briefly that they finally held the advantage, but Logan still had one last card to play. He triggered an internal alarm, fabricating a report claiming Amelia Cole was suffering a mental breakdown, attacking security personnel and sabotaging company servers. He routed this false account to the building's emergency response team and to several board members, ensuring that if police arrived to find Ethan injured, doors destroyed, and servers damaged, Amelia could be detained before she ever had the chance to speak. Mason recognized immediately that Logan was constructing a legal trap rather than a physical one, understanding that a man like him did not need to kill Amelia if he could simply make the public believe she had lost her mind. Amelia nearly broke under the weight of that realization, having spent years cultivating the image of an untouchable, distant executive with few people left who genuinely stood behind her, a vulnerability Logan had exploited from the very beginning. Mason told her they needed a living witness and evidence on the ground, since Ethan, restrained as he was, would say nothing as long as Logan kept paying him. The last remaining henchman, however, might be the weaker link in the chain. Mason picked up a faint radio signal showing the man hiding near the 45th floor, and rather than continuing to flee downward, he decided to lead Amelia toward a secondary security control room to retrieve unedited access logs, untouched camera footage, and a recording of Logan's threats. When Amelia asked why he would willingly walk back into danger, Mason answered that running only saved tonight, while evidence saved tomorrow, a line that crystallized the deeper truth of everything he had done so far. Real protection was never only about shielding a body, it was about helping the wounded reclaim their own truth. They descended toward the 45th floor through a secondary emergency stairwell, Mason moving slower now, the wound at his side slowing his steps. For the first time, Amelia reached out to support him rather than the other way around, a small but significant reversal in their dynamic. Where the night had begun with Mason protecting Amelia, it now showed two wounded, isolated people choosing deliberately to stand on the same side. At the secondary control room, they discovered that Logan had erased most of the main camera feeds, but had overlooked the building's technical maintenance cameras, assuming no one would think to check them. Those cameras had captured Ethan and his men entering the building using access credentials issued under Logan's own account, undeniable proof of his involvement. Amelia copied everything onto a small storage device, while Mason simultaneously opened an internal broadcast channel into the boardroom on the 50th floor, where several board members had been summoned by Logan under the pretense of an urgent crisis. Logan discovered the intrusion and ordered every door on the 45th floor locked, abandoning all pretense of civility. Through the speaker, he sneered that Amelia was exactly like her father, too slow to understand who truly held the power, a remark that ignited her anger without breaking her composure. Rather than lashing out, she grew colder, more deliberate, telling Mason that if Logan intended to bury her in that very boardroom, she would walk into it herself, evidence in hand. Mason forced open a stairwell door using nothing but practice technique, and the two of them began climbing toward the 50th floor, while downstairs, police and building security had already arrived in the lobby, carrying a version of events that painted the chief executive as the danger inside her own company. The 50th floor housed the boardroom where Cole Meridian's directors typically gathered, and that night Logan had summoned several key members under the claim that Amelia's discoveries posed an urgent threat requiring her immediate suspension as chief executive. He had already prepared a resolution transferring temporary operating authority to himself, fully expecting that if police detained Amelia or the board judged her unstable, the document would be signed before sunrise. Mason and Amelia approached the boardroom through a service corridor, and Mason suggested she wait while he delivered the evidence without exposing her directly to further risk. Amelia refused. She had let other people speak for her for far too long, and this time she intended to walk in herself. Mason did not argue. He simply checked the door, the sight lines, the exits, then asked if she was ready, and she admitted she was not certain, but she would do it anyway. Inside, Logan addressed the board with practiced performative grief, claiming Amelia had been unstable since her father's death, recently exhibiting paranoid behavior, and had hired an unverified maintenance worker to help her sabotage company servers. He displayed images of an injured Ethan in a damaged server room to reinforce his narrative, and several board members visibly wavered under the weight of it. At that precise moment, the boardroom door opened. Amelia stepped through, her jacket coated in dust, her face exhausted but her eyes entirely clear, with Mason following silently behind her like a shadow no one had expected. The room fell into stunned silence. Logan immediately demanded that security restrain Mason, but Amelia raised the storage device containing the technical camera footage and announced that before anyone signed anything, they would see the truth first. Logan tried to cut the feed, but Mason had already rerouted the signal through an auxiliary port. The footage played across the main screen, Ethan entering the building using Logan's own access credentials, his men forcing open the executive office, Logan threatening Amelia over the internal speaker system, and Logan demanding she sign a confession of guilt. The boardroom went silent. Logan's face drained of color, though he still tried to claim the footage could have been manipulated. At that moment, Madison Grant appeared through a video call from outside the building, confirming she had received the data package Amelia had sent earlier that night. Carter Hayes joined the call as well, explaining that Amelia's electronic signature on several past transactions had been manipulated through administrative privileges that only Logan controlled. Carter recognized Mason immediately, identifying him as the man who had once safely protected two witnesses during a federal financial crimes case years earlier. That single statement transformed how everyone in the room viewed Mason. The poor maintenance worker was no longer a suspicious presence, but the one person who had kept the company's chief executive alive long enough for the truth to surface. Cornered, Logan turned to personal attacks, claiming Amelia lacked the capacity to lead a company if she had to depend on a hired man to survive a single night. Amelia answered without hesitation that true leadership was never about needing no one, but about knowing exactly who to trust once every powerful man around her had proven himself a liar. It was, for Amelia, a moment of genuine transformation, the instant the cold, image-conscious executive finally admitted, openly, that she had been manipulated, that she had signed documents she should never have signed, yet refused to let that shame turn her into anyone's puppet ever again. Police arrived on the 50th floor moments later. Logan assumed they had come for Amelia, but Carter had already forwarded the evidence to a federal investigator hours earlier. The first person ordered to remain exactly where he stood was Logan Pierce. Logan did not surrender easily. When officers and the investigator asked him to hand over his personal devices, he tore a firearm from a loyal private guard still standing near him and seized Madison Grant as a hostage the instant she arrived on the 50th floor. Chaos erupted through the boardroom. Board members scrambled backward, Amelia was pulled away from the center of the room, and Mason placed himself instantly between the crowd and Logan, calm even as panic spread around him. Logan was no longer the composed executive who had addressed the board with practiced grief. He was a man fully exposed, shouting that he had saved the company from the Cole family's weakness, that Joseph Cole had been too principled to win, and that Amelia was too naive to ever truly hold power. He demanded a way out and ordered Amelia to surrender the original hard drive. Mason understood Logan had become desperate, and desperation made him more dangerous, not less. He did not move toward him directly, since any sudden action risked Madison's life, choosing instead to engage Logan verbally, drawing his attention away from her completely. Mason used his own painful history as leverage, telling Logan that men who betray others always believe themselves clever, when in truth they are only skilled at choosing victims who trust them too easily. The remark struck something raw in Logan, visibly unsettling him. Behind Mason, Amelia noticed blood soaking through his side from the earlier fight in the server room and understood, with a sinking certainty, that he could not hold out much longer. She stepped forward instead, telling Logan calmly that the original hard drive no longer mattered, since copies had already reached multiple destinations beyond his control. Losing what remained of his composure, Logan swung the gun toward Amelia, and in that exact instant Mason moved. He shoved a boardroom chair into the line of fire, threw himself forward, locked both hands around Logan's wrist and drove him down across the conference table with full force. A single shot fired upward into the ceiling as Madison broke free and stumbled to safety, while officers swarmed Logan and pinned him to the floor. Mason sank to his knees, the old wound torn open further by the struggle, and Amelia rushed to him without a trace of the distance she once kept between herself and her employees. He managed a faint, half-serious remark that locking the door at the very beginning had been the right call after all, and Amelia laughed through tears, the release of an entire night of unbearable tension finally arriving all at once. Once Logan had been led away in restraints, Amelia faced the consequences waiting on the other side of that victory. The company would face investigation, its stock could collapse overnight, and the press would not be gentle with her. Carter reassured her that exposing the truth early would ultimately spare Cole Meridian a far greater disaster down the line, and the board, after deliberation, agreed to allow Amelia to remain chief executive on the condition that she cooperate fully with every aspect of the investigation. She accepted without hesitation, refusing to dodge responsibility the way Logan had tried to dodge his own. Paramedics examined Mason's injuries on scene, and when Amelia asked if he regretted ever becoming involved in any of it, he looked toward the shattered boardroom door, then toward the city slowly emerging from the storm, and told her he had spent years regretting a door that opened too late. Tonight, at least, he had locked the right one in time. Dawn began breaking over Chicago as Amelia and Mason walked out of the building together, no longer simply a chief executive and a maintenance worker, but two people who had survived a night that had permanently changed them both. Weeks later, Cole Meridian Group remained in turmoil but did not collapse. Logan Pierce faced prosecution for financial fraud, witness intimidation, manipulation of electronic signatures, and the unauthorized hiring of an illegal security operation. Ethan Vale agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, confirming that Logan had personally ordered the operation carried out during the storm. The network of shell companies tied to the stolen funds was frozen entirely. Amelia's public reputation suffered real damage, yet public opinion began shifting once she addressed the crisis openly, accepting accountability for her company's failures and committing to a complete overhaul of its internal systems. She refused to present herself as a flawless victim. During a public statement, she admitted she had trusted the wrong person, had isolated herself without realizing it, and had once believed that strength meant never appearing vulnerable. But she also insisted that truth could not remain buried simply because the person revealing it had once made mistakes herself. That single statement became the turning point in how the public viewed her, slowly restoring a measure of the trust she had lost. Mason returned to his ordinary life, though he was no longer invisible the way he had once been. He declined the board's initial offer of a substantial financial reward, unwilling to be seen as a man who could be quietly paid into silence. Amelia did not push the matter further. Instead, she later offered him a position as an independent advisor for the company's internal security and whistleblower protection program. Mason hesitated at first, wary of being pulled back into a world that had already cost him so much. He told her plainly that work like this had taken nearly everything from him once before. Amelia did not try to persuade him with authority or pressure. She simply told him the program did not need someone who craved danger, only someone who understood, intimately, the fear of those being hunted. Mason considered her words for a long time, eventually realizing that the night on the 47th floor had not dragged him back into his old life, but had given him a chance to redefine what that life had meant, allowing him to use skills that once destroyed him in a way that could finally protect others honestly and openly. That evening, when Mason returned to his small apartment, he found a short note left on the kitchen table by his daughter, a simple reminder for him to eat dinner before it got too late. The detail was small, almost nothing, yet it captured everything he had been fighting to protect throughout the entire ordeal. Not recognition, not reward, only the quiet, ordinary life he had built so carefully around her. Sometime later, Amelia visited Mason at a modest diner, arriving without bodyguards, without cameras, without any trace of the executive persona she usually wore in public. She returned the scorched maintenance badge that had survived the night of the storm, telling him the company had replaced every lock in the building, yet one door still remained difficult for her to open. The door of trusting another person again after years of betrayal. Mason told her that no one opens a door like that in a single day, but that she had at least stopped handing her keys to the wrong people. What grew between them afterward was something closer to healing than romance, slow and unhurried, neither of them in a rush to call it anything more than what it honestly was. Amelia respected the boundaries Mason had built around his quiet life, and Mason respected the responsibility she now carried with far more clarity than before. Neither of them saved the other through perfection, they simply chose to remain standing exactly when the other believed she or he had been left entirely alone. The story closed on another evening at Cole Meridian, this time without any storm at all. Amelia walked the corridor of the 47th floor, past the executive office whose door had since been completely replaced, while Mason performed one final inspection of the new locking system before handing the project over for good. Amelia paused at the doorway and told him that if he had not locked that door on the night of the storm, she would have lost absolutely everything. Mason answered quietly that sometimes locking a door was never about trapping someone inside, but about keeping the darkness from ever stepping through. The story ended as Amelia locked the office door behind her with her own hand, no longer out of fear, but because she had finally learned how to protect her own truth. Mason walked toward the elevator, lighter than he had been in years, and as the door closed behind him, it no longer carried the weight of danger it once had. This time, it simply marked the quiet beginning of something new. Outside, the city carried on the way cities always do, indifferent to the private storms survived inside their towers, and somewhere below, a small apartment waited with a kitchen light left on and a note still resting on the table. Mason no longer measured his life by the danger he had walked away from, but by the ordinary evenings he had fought so hard to keep. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe both could exist in the same life without one destroying the other.